What's up guys, Amél here back in the studio, and today I want to teach you 7 things on how to make your tracks go from an intermediate production level to a pro level that's ready to release. Let's talk about it. Okay guys, so recently I found out that one of my subscribers by the name of Neri remade my track Blame It on the Timing, and this is the project we have opened now. So I listened to it and it was a super good remake, and so I decided I wanted to sort of compare this remake to my original track and use that as a learning tool to compare the tracks and teach you guys the 7 things that really make a track go from sort of an intermediate production level to a really polished and clean production that is ready to release. So first, let's take a listen to the remake versus the original and hear the differences, and then we can use those tracks to learn about those 7 things to make your tracks sound pro. All right, so there we have it, my original track versus the remake. First of all, I just want to say congrats to Neri. This is a super good remake. With that said, hopefully you could hear some differences between the original track and this remake. And the differences pretty much is just that my original track, it just has sort of a more like full and polished sound. Everything just sounds a little more cohesive, and there's sort of that sound of, I would say, like organic sounding. Trying to get away from that sort of like 4 to the floor synthy kind of production, if that makes any sense. Anyway, now that we've heard the comparison between those 2 tracks, let's jump into those 7 things on how to make your production sound pro. Okay guys, so the first thing I want to talk about is sound selection and sound design. Now what I've done here is I've actually brought in all the stems. I've exported the stems from my original track so we can sort of hear the difference between just individual sections. So I'm just going to play this, the lead that Neri made, and then we'll hear the difference between that and the original. So hopefully you could hear from that comparison that Neri actually got very close to my leads with the remake he's done. So that's very good. So let's go ahead and take a look at what he's done for the leads. This first lead is actually from my sound bank. Then he's used a lot of sounds from the Fusion sound banks and some more from my sound bank again down here. I think he has about maybe 10 or 12 leads or so, which I'm a big fan of. I'm personally a big fan of creating lots of layers and having sounds that are maybe not necessarily the best, but added together, they sound really good. With that said, once you've gotten all those sounds and you're pretty happy with them, it all comes down to processing. So let's take a look at how he's processed these sounds. So we're here in the mixer, and you can see he's actually separated all these leads out into individual channels, which is very good. I would say it's a more sort of intermediate to advanced technique. A lot of times, and I'll still do this even sometimes, beginner producers, intermediate producers will just take all the sounds and shoot them into one bus. So they would have just this bus here, say for instance, and just send all the tracks to that. That's fine, but you don't have quite as much control as putting all the sounds into individual channels. This way, if you have them in individual channels, you can actually process them individually, separately. In this case, what he's done is you can pretty much see he just has an EQ on each channel, which is fine. But compared to my original remake, on each of these channels, I would, even on some of them, I would have some EQ and distortion and maybe stereo enhancing, stuff like that. So this is pretty good, but if you want to take it to the even next level, you can, start adding even more plugins on each individual channel. The other thing to consider is the bus that you're sending all these to. These go to the lead bus, and you can see his processing here. It looks pretty good. If I were to go in and start manipulating these sounds, I might start adding a couple more things like stereo enhancing. I might add some more EQs and stuff just to really shape that sound. Also, very quickly, as a second example for sound design, I want to show you these chords. So let's take a quick listen to the remake chords versus the original chords. Okay, so hopefully you can actually see quite a bit of a difference there. And the biggest difference First of all is sound selection. So in my original track, I actually chose to use a lot of pianos, and I used some synth, but they were a lot more sort of cut off. So it just had this more like kind of organic feel to the sound. And then the other thing is, like we talked about, processing those sounds. As you can hear, the remake chords are just very dry. So it's still helping fill up those frequencies, but it just doesn't have quite as much character. So remember that. Pick sounds, experiment with sounds, try using real instruments, guitars, pianos, violins, like that. And that can also really help sort of elevate the whole sound of your track. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about, I'm actually going to list it as number 1.5 because it kind of ties into the sound design part of things. But that is stereo imaging. And this is something that I think a lot of people sort of overlook. Especially, I see this in a lot of remakes, is the actual sound of a remake will sound pretty good. But if you listen very closely, you'll notice that in the original track, the bass might be kind of mono. And in the remake, the bass is very wide, or same goes with the leads or chords or whatever. So I think stereo imaging is a very important thing, and it's not paid attention to as much as it should. So with that in mind, let's take a listen one more time to the leads. I'm going to sort of A-B, the remake versus my original track. And you're going to need headphones for this because it's very subtle. But I want you to take a listen to how wide the remake leads are versus how wide the original leads are. Like I said, it's very subtle, but hopefully you can notice that the leads in my original track are actually a bit more mono. They're not completely mono because that would just sound weird. But it's very subtle and it makes somewhat of a difference. So there's a couple ways you can do this. The first way is you can just go in here and add a stereo enhancer and literally just drag down the width of the sound. If I do that, that's going to start sounding like this. So you can see that's obviously made the sound a lot narrower, which is not bad. I certainly use stereo enhancing on some of my buses at certain points, but there's one technique that's a little more advanced that I actually use in my original track. So let me show you what that is. What we're going to do is we're going to go to more plugins, and I'm going to search up Patcher. What you can do here is open up mid-side EQ. So what this allows you to do is, this is a mid-side EQ, so it basically splits out the mono frequencies from the stereo frequencies. So here you have your mono frequencies. So what I'll do is I'll turn down this volume, and if I play it, you'll just hear the stereo frequencies. And vice versa. If I turn down these stereo frequencies and just listen to the mono frequencies, you'll just hear the center. So this allows you to do some kind of advanced stuff where you can actually EQ the mono frequencies and the outer frequencies. And so this is a very good way, instead of using just a regular stereo enhancer and widening the sound or narrowing the sound, what I'll actually do is I'll come in, and this is on the stereo frequencies again, and you can actually maybe like take off some of the top end or take out some of the frequencies from the stereo. So watch what happens when I start doing that. So I'll turn this off and then back on again. So that might be a little overkill. I probably did it a little exaggerated, but you can see that we're actually kind of making the sound more mono, not by actually squishing everything into the center, but simply by taking away certain frequencies on either the stereo field, or if you want to make it wider, you could add some frequencies on the stereo field. So that kind of allows you to shape the sound in the stereo imaging, not by actually squishing it or expanding it, but by being very fine-tuned with different frequencies that you're working with. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about, and this is actually number 2, not 1.5 anymore, is note length. This is something that is a very important part of creating your melodies and really changes the feel of the whole track. And what I mean by this is, if you go in here, you can see that I can drag out these notes further or shorter, and it doesn't seem like it would make a huge difference, but it really does. So let me find a section in this track where I can sort of give you an example of how this sounds. Okay, so this is actually a perfect example literally in the first couple bars. What I want you to focus on is this section right here, these 2 notes, where it goes da-da-da. So listen one more time. Here's the remake, and here's the original. Hopefully in the original you can hear that it goes da-da-da-da, versus in the remake it sort of sounds a little bit more choppy. It's like da-da-da-da. It's like a little bit more staccato. It's a very subtle thing, but all these things really add up to make a difference in the end. So let me go into this MIDI and show you what I mean. So what we're going to do is we're literally going to drag this note out a little bit further. You might even go all the way. Maybe just, we'll try all the way first. Okay, so we've adjusted the note length. Now let's take a listen. Versus the original. And hopefully you can hear that was a pretty subtle difference, but it actually adds up to be quite, it just sounds a lot better. Even that simple, tiny little detail. And that's just one note. So then if we look down at the bass too, you can see that these bass notes aren't connected as well. So if I were to go through and change each little individual note and get every little detail to where it sounds exactly right, things like that are really going to add up, help fill out the space, and that's overall going to make a really big difference. Okay, thing number 3. The third thing I want to talk about is automation clips. Automation clips is something that I think a lot of people use a little bit of, but don't realize that you can use a lot of automation clips. So as you can see in this track, there's one automation clip, and this is just controlling the reverb. And then there's a couple automation clips down here, but essentially these are all the same ones. These are just controlling the cutoff, which is fine. But what you can do, and if you look at my original track, I probably have like at least 5 or 6 different automation clips. That could include reverb, that could include delay, that could include volumes of individual synths. Like I could go in here and create an automation clip for an individual synthesizer, so it either gets louder or drops down at a certain point. I'll have automation clips for things like stereo enhancing. Sometimes I'll have automation clips for things like EQ, so at a certain point it boosts certain frequencies or dips down certain frequencies. The list goes on and on and on, and I won't get too into it now, but just think about that in your productions, that when you're going through, it could be for leads, it could be for chords, basses. A lot of times I'll have each individual automation clips for each different instrument. So you can get very complicated with it. At first, it sounds like it's a bit overkill, but those are the kind of things that if you do enough of and have things changing over time, that's what really makes the track stay interesting and overall just adds up to make a very big difference in the end. Okay, the fourth thing I want to talk about is chord voicing / your bass line. If you guys don't know what I mean by this, I'm just going to open this up here. Basically, if you have these chords, which are obviously in the key of the song, you have your melody, and then you build the chords under them. Let me just play you these chords for a second. You can hear that it sounds good, but I can go like this and take this down an octave. Obviously, that's the same note, so I could say maybe take this up an octave. Technically, those are the same chords, but you've changed the voicing, so it has a totally different feel. So that's something to keep in mind. Play around with your chord voicings and see sort of what emotion changes, see if it fits your melody better. The other thing to keep in mind is not just chord voicings, but you can actually play around with individual notes. So if I go like this, something like this maybe, if I just change these 2 notes. And then back up here. Already, just by changing those couple little notes, you can hear that it sounds just much more interesting, right? It keeps the chord line flowing. It just sounds a whole lot more sort of emotional, gives the whole feel of the song a lot more character. And with that said, I'm just going to show you that I actually did something. I don't know if I did those exact notes, but I did something very similar. So here are my chords in the original, and you can hear that there's just these little subtle changes in the notes. There's just all these little subtle things. It's almost like you're making a counter melody with the chords. So you have your main melody, and then you have all these notes changing in the chords, which makes a counter melody. And overall, again, I'm going to keep saying this, it's a very small, subtle thing, but you just keep adding up all these subtle things, and that's what really makes the track interesting and sort of feel alive. Okay, so the second example for chord voicings is going to be the bass. This is a very important one for 2 reasons. The first reason is having your bass line go up certain octaves and going to certain notes obviously influences the sound of your track. But there's also the second part of that, which is that you have to be very careful about how low and how high your bass line goes, because especially with the sub frequencies, there's just certain notes that really are too low for the sub bass and really too high for the sub bass. So you want to make sure that you're going to octave and to correct notes that actually fit that. And this is something that stands out. So really quickly, let's listen to how the bass line sounds in the remake versus my track. So here's the remake. So this is the part I want you to pay attention to, just right here. And then if we go over here and we listen to the bass line that I've created. Okay, did you catch it yet? Let's play this one more time. Okay, so guys, if you haven't noticed by now, this in the remake actually goes down an octave versus in my track, it actually goes up an octave. You don't think that makes a huge difference, but it really changes the energy, as well as, like I said, this is actually in a bad range for the sub bass. So what we can do is, this is just going to be very quick. We can just go in here and grab all these notes and just put them up an octave. Okay, so I've taken just a couple minutes and rearranged some of these notes, and now check out how it sounds. Subtle change like that, all of a sudden it just clicks and it's like, okay, that sounds way better. So chord voicings, bass voicings, keep that in mind when you're making your tracks. Okay, so the fifth thing I want to talk to you about is one-shots, growls, horns, just little reverses, and all sorts of ear candy. This is something I know that Brooks has talked about and a lot of other artists have as well, but it is super, super important to use these techniques in your track to really help fill out the track and give it that extra sort of polished touch. And this will become very obvious in just a second. So with that said, let's listen to the bass line in the remake versus the bass line in my track, and you'll see exactly why it's so different. Here is the bass line of the remake. As you can hear, it actually sounds really good. The actual sound selection and processing of these sounds is a really fat bass line. It sounds great. But very quickly, let's jump over here and I'll show you just why the original track that I made is going to sound so much more full. Okay, so hopefully you can see at just a first glance, these are in fact all bass layers. And I'll go through each one and explain what's going on. So first we have my main bass line, which is going to sound very similar to the one in the remake. Sounds good. Then we have a whole second layer, which is filled with growls. And we have about 4 or 5 layers just filled with little one-shots on very specific notes. And we add those all up. Then down here, we actually have a second layer of growls. On top of that, we also have horn shots. And of course, the sub bass. Okay, so let's take a listen to how much of a difference this actually makes. First, I'm just going to solo the bass line and the sub bass, which sounds like this. Which at first, you just hear it, it's like, okay, that sounds great, how could it be better? But check this out, we're just going to slowly start adding in layers. Already that's made a huge difference. Now we're going to add in the second growls. And finally, we're going to add in all these one-shots and horns. And here's the final bass line. So I think that might be one of the most sort of obvious comparisons in this whole video, is showing you just the bass line with just sort of one layer of basses versus all these. Hopefully that was obvious to you too, that makes a huge, huge difference. And that's even for me. I'll still start a track sometimes and completely forget to do that and be like, oh my God, why is my track sounding so empty? And as you just heard, those little things, let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I have 9 different instruments all playing sort of the same bass, right? With these little one-shots and stuff added on certain notes. So that's a huge part of making a track sound full, is adding those layers up. I know we just spent a lot of time talking about the basses, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about these other things, but just as an example, you can see that I have multiple lead layers as well as chord layers, so I'm very quickly going to go through them. So let's first listen to the leads. That's just sort of on one octave there, and then check out the second part. Even in this one stem, you can hear in the second part, I have an octave that actually jumps further down. Also right here, I have this part that comes in, as well as this one that's actually a harmony. So that all adds up like this. And then over here, in the second part, I actually have a fourth layer that comes in up top, which is a vocal layer. And same thing with the chords. Here are the chords right at this spot. And you can see down here, if I add these in, these are some reverses. Again, a little bit subtle, but it just helps fill out that space and overall makes a huge difference. Okay, the sixth thing I want to talk to you about is actually going to be sound selection for your drums, everything that is not the instruments. And this is a very important step too. The kick in particular makes a huge difference in the overall feel of your track. So take your time to go through and first of all, pick good sounds. And second of all, don't be afraid to layer sounds. So first of all, I'm going to play the remake of the track with just the drums and take a listen. Sounds pretty good, but it's pretty much 4 to the floor with a tiny bit of percussion. And now with that, let's take a listen to these drums. And also keep in mind with this that there were originally actually a couple more layers that I just didn't export for this. Okay, so hopefully you can hear the difference between those two. And I think I actually used a very similar kick in my original track, but the one thing that I ended up doing is I did a little processing on the kick. I might have EQ'd some of it. I also added a top kick. So I actually took 2 kicks and sort of mixed them together to get a kick that just fit the track a little bit better. The other thing that hopefully you can hear is there's a lot more toms and sort of off rhythm things in the original drums that I made. On top of that, there's sort of this like crispiness to the claps. First of all, I have these drop claps that help fill up the space. And then just the overall sound of the drums, there's just a little bit like more high end and sort of processing going on that makes it sound just a bit more present in the mix. And you can hear that's kind of lacking a little bit from the remake. And then also, I think if we go into the second half of the drop, there's some more percussion that comes in that's going to help make it a little more obvious. Okay, tip number 7, and this is the final tip, and this tip sort of recaps some of the stuff we've been talking about. But this is to add layers, fill up the spaces, fill up the gaps. And there's a couple different ways to do this. The first way is, like I showed you before, all these little bits and pieces in the instruments themselves. So things like this, little reverses, extra layers, extra growls, things like that, that just layer on top of the existing instruments. Things like harmonies, those all make a huge difference. The other thing is, like we were just talking about with the drums, things like this. You can see this is my layer with the toms. You can see I've actually added a second tom in there, so it's not just the same tom doing all these off-rhythm things. And just little fills, little glitches like this. These are things that have to be in specific places, but I would say once you get your track to maybe like 80% or so, you can just start going in and thinking, okay, here's the sort of melody of the song. How can I enhance that melody? How can I add elements that fit with the rhythm of it, maybe go a little off rhythm, but all sound sort of coherent and really elevate the melody? Because with tracks like this, you're really trying to create one main melody and all the other elements are there to support it, whether it's little growls, whether it's little reverses, things like that. So take some time, really go in there, maybe bounce out some audio of your lead, reverse it, maybe add some reverb somewhere, different stuff like that. All those tiny little details are really going to make a big difference. Okay guys, well that's going to be it for this week's video. I know it was a bit longer than normal, but let me know if you guys like this format. I think I'm able to sort of teach you a bit more stuff on music production and go a bit more in depth with a longer video like this. If you're interested in checking out more details about my original track, Blame It on the Timing, I know it's been out for a long time now, but I will actually be doing a full walkthrough of that track next week, so we can actually go into the original project file and I can show you exactly all the details on the actual original project file. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be coming out next week. I'm really excited to share that project with you. Other than that, again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you back in the next one. See ya. What's up guys, Amél here back in the studio, and today I want to teach you 7 tips on how to make your